would I be accurate to interpret that this week is kind of do or die time in the Bloc's view?
Yes.
You're in a really bad spot, folks. Yeah, like I said, I think this is going to be the scandal that brings down the government. The Bloc announced today that it has officially revised its ultimatum to Justin Trudeau. If their private member's bill C-319 is not given royal recommendation by the end of the week, they are officially done supporting the Liberals.
Let's take a look.
Does today's vote mean the Bloc is more likely to try to topple the Trudeau government? The Bloc's Deputy House Leader, Christian Normandin, is with us now. Hi, Madame Normandin. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, there's that little teaser. So, before we get into this, what happened on Wednesday after question period was a vote was held on an opposition motion. Now, after yesterday's video about Fergus freezing Parliament, we had a lot of questions about, well, does this affect confidence votes or anything like that? You know, someone said this sounds like they basically, prorogue Parliament without proroguing it. No. The only thing that stops, well, everything that stops is all government-related bills and all government-related business. Now, the opposition is not the government, so anything that they have can keep going. One of those things that kept going was a vote on an opposition motion, and this is related to the demands and the ultimatum from the Bloc. Now, what they said was that by the end of the month, if Bill C-319 does not get royal recommendation and passed, then they are officially pulling their support. Now, the issue is that passing a bill takes a long time.
It sure does.
And it's stuck in the Senate. Now, what Fergus says, in terms of shutting down the House of Commons, in terms of the government business, he doesn't have authority over the Senate, so the Senate can do as they wish. But the Senate can't pass that bill unless it has royal recommendation because it needs money. $3 billion roughly a year, according to the parliamentary budget officer. So what the Bloc did, and it was very, very sneaky of them, is they weren't getting a yes or no answer from the Liberals on whether they're going to support this, so they introduced a motion that would be voted on to try to force them to declare their hand.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 181, 181. Nays contre 143, 143.
I declare the motion carried.
So what happened today is the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc voted for this, basically saying, yes, this should go forward, and the Liberals voted against it. Now, does the Conservatives actually want this to go ahead? Don't know. They probably don't care. What they care about is the fact that all the opposition parties are continually lining up against the Liberals. So this is a game of cat and mouse between the Bloc as well as the Liberals. So let's see what went down.
I just spoke with the government House Leader, Minister Gould, and she did not unequivocally say no to the proposition. She maintains that her opposition and the federal cabinet's opposition today to your motion was about setting a precedent, not necessarily opposing the boost to OAS. Is that your understanding as well? Is your sense that the government is still open to that proposition?
Well, I won't put words in her mouth. That's what has been mentioned to us, that it was more of a procedural thing rather than saying no on the basics, on the grounds of our demand today. So yes, the window seems to be closing, though, on our demands, but it's not completely shut. So we still hope that we can use the next few days to make the gains that we are aimed at. So the fact that they didn't say total no today to our demand still gives us hope, but the time is running though, and that's something that we have to remember. It takes maybe 48 hours to get the royal recommendation, but if we get it on October 28th, it would be too much at the end of our ultimatum, and if we see that in the next few days or so, there's no going further with the royal recommendation, then we might take our ultimatum a bit faster and start having discussions with other parties, seeing that it would become impossible for our bill to pass prior to the deadline that we have set.
So would I be accurate to interpret that this week is kind of do or die time in the BLOC's view?
Yes, kind of. We can see it day by day, and there will still be discussions, but we won't be unnecessarily patient. We'll see with what will be put on the table if there's still a chance that our bill passes. And as soon as we see, well, there's no chance, we'll start to have the discussions we'll need to have with other parties, as we mentioned we would. So there's no surprise on our side. It's all up to the government to decide. And there's still a message that was sent today. The House voted in majority in order for the government to grant the royal recommendation to the bill. So that's something positive that came out of it. And the fact that the government was specifically asked on their position on the royal recommendation, and they didn't just say a solid no is positive, but time really seems to be running a bit faster now.
So there you have it. It takes time to get royal recommendation. It takes time to actually, pass this. And here's the thing. If Trudeau actually commits to his word and says, well, the Senate is independent, well, then they get to decide their own schedule and their orders of business. So if that is true, then it sounds like the BLOC is concerned that if they don't get royal recommendation by the end of this week, then their bill is not going to get on the calendar for the rest of October, and therefore won't be passed by their deadline. And what that would mean is, well, they're done. And so basically there's a point of no return that they're looking at. And if the Liberals go past that day, they're going to say, well, at this point, it's impossible. And at that point, they are going to be working with the Conservatives to say, okay, let's bring down the government. And then both the BLOC and the Conservatives are going to then be putting a mountain of pressure on the NDP, publicly and privately, in order to have them vote non-confidence.
That's right, because if the BLOC and the Conservatives are very publicly stating that they're ready to topple this government, especially if they use the SDTC scandal as their reasoning, and the NDP are still willing to support the Liberals despite all the taxpayer money that's being squandered in the SDTC scandal, that's going to look really bad for them. So for the NDP, it's going to be, do we go to election right now? And yes, we're going to lose some seats now, but we're going to lose even more if we wait.
And I do have questions about the proposition itself. I just want to ask one more kind of technicality. When you talk about what happens if the deadline that the BLOC has set comes to pass, or even in advance of that, Mr. Blanchet has mentioned talking with other opposition parties. Does the BLOC feel that it will be able to force an election should that be necessary? Because I think that the government's sense is that they would still be able to lean, for example, on New Democrats in order to stay in power.
Well, there's plenty of things that we don't control. What we mentioned we would do was to start having discussions on how to topple the government, but we cannot promise to topple the government because it needs discussions with other parties, and other things can happen in the meanwhile as well. The government could decide to go for prorogation or to call for an election itself. So there's plenty of things that could still happen that we don't have control over. What we mentioned we would do was to start having discussions, and that's exactly what we'll do as soon as we see that our bills won't make it before the deadline of October 29th. So that's what we said we would do. That's what we'll do.
Okay, so talking about prorogation, and we've mentioned it before, but to Tanya, what's prorogation?
So prorogation is when they kind of stop the current session of Parliament, and then everything, all the bills, everything in committee, everything dies. Just it stops in its tracks and it's done. Prorogation can be anywhere from a day to up to 364 days, because our Constitution says that Parliament needs to meet at least once per year. It never really goes that long. Most recently, the average length of prorogation was something like 22 days within the past, I don't know how many parliaments. I think it was like past 6 parliaments. Anyways, it's a way for the government to kind of reset. What happens is the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General, recommends prorogation. Governor General grants prorogation, and everything stops for an indeterminate length of time. When they come back, they have to give a speech from the throne, and that's when the other parties get to vote confidence or non-confidence in the government.
Right, and this is very, very key. So at the beginning of the session, there will be a speech from the throne. That's what is intended, is for the government in power to essentially lay out what their agenda is and what they're going to do, and then everybody votes on it, as Tanya said. So what the options are for the Liberals are, they're few and limited considering what they have in front of them.
Yeah.
So in one respect, they have to turn over the SDTC scandal documents or risk not moving any government legislation through the House until the next election. That would look pretty bad for them. So that's not great. The other consequence of that is if any of the Liberal cabinet ministers are implicated, which it seems that they might be based on what we've seen, you could look at jail and arrests and everything else in between. That wouldn't be good for the Liberal Party either.
No, it wouldn't.
So their other option is to not do anything, at which point the NDP will be forced to vote non-confidence in this government, because otherwise, if they don't, then the support that they have will completely disappear, because all you will hear from everybody, including the mainstream media, might I add, is that the NDP are still propping up this government that is essentially hobbling along on a broken leg, not giving out documents, and not doing what they need to do in terms of addressing this SDTC scandal.
Well, and they can't pass anything through the House.
Right, so they're completely ineffective. So how could you
Right.
have confidence in a government that can't get anything done?
Right, and the reason they can't get anything done is because they're being accused of massive corruption.
And a massive cover-up in plain sight.
Yeah. Now, another thing that the government could do to weasel out of this is they could call an election themselves. They don't need the other parties to call an election. They could go to the Governor General. Actually, the Prime Minister could go to the Governor General and recommend that she dissolve Parliament. And that's exactly what happened in 2021 when the Winnipeg lab scandal was getting too hot for comfort for Trudeau. He went to the Governor General and requested that Parliament be dissolved, and Canada went to election.
Which is exactly what Trudeau has kept criticizing Stephen Harper for. So if he prorogues Parliament, he opens himself up to that criticism. He also opens himself up to the criticism of dodging everything that's going on. He also completely ticks off the NDP because that would completely cancel their pharmacare bill, and it would tick off the BLOC because that would kill their bill as well. So it is a lose situation for the Liberals here. Now, if they do prorogue Parliament, they cannot prorogue it for 365 days as of right now, because the problem is that would interfere with the timeline of the next scheduled election, and that's in the Constitution as well. So Parliament needs to, it would basically be prorogued until the end of the spring session, and then that's it.
So to recap, the Liberal Party right now has 4 options. Number 1, they can hand over the documents to the from the SDTC scandal to the RCMP. Number 2 is they could not hand over the documents, and they can keep being stubborn, and they can get no work done in the House. Number 3 is that they can call an election themselves by asking the Governor General to dissolve Parliament. And number 4 is that they can prorogue Parliament by asking the Governor General to do so.
And that would no doubt lead to an election, because they would no doubt prorogue it until, I would say,
whatever.
It's
right?
either going to be until the spring session or until June. It's going to be one or the other. And what would happen in that time? No doubt Trudeau's caucus will force him to step down. That's most likely what would happen, because it would be unrecoverable at this point. It is unrecoverable at this point.
They're in a really bad spot, folks.
Yeah,
like I said, I think this is going to be the scandal that brings down the government.
Yeah, it is just a question of how it happens. Now, even if the government gives in to the bloc's demands, there's still the SDTC scandal that they have to contend with.
Right.
So there's so many problems that are going on, with them. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And but if Trudeau does resign, that would probably be the first hit to, I would say, all the opposition parties as they head into a next election, because a lot of them have been complaining specifically about Justin Trudeau. And with him gone, it opens up the opportunity for another leader to step in.
But he hasn't left anybody strong enough in his cabinet to take his place. He can't list Mark Carney as the leader because, well, he's not an MP.
Right, exactly. So you have to be a sitting MP in order to do that. And there's not enough time for a by-election.
Well, what they could theoretically do, and again, this doesn't make sense. He needs an interim leader first. So he needs to pick somebody from cabinet as interim leader. And then the Liberal Party across the country needs to choose the actual leader.
Right.
And if they do select Mark Carney, then he needs to win a riding. They'll probably stick him in a riding that is guaranteed to win. But really, after Toronto St. Paul's and after LaSalle and Verdun, are there any guaranteed ridings in this country anymore?
Well, yeah, and here's something to think about. So remember Han Dong? Don Valley North, right?
That was a guaranteed riding. That's why, allegedly, he was put into that riding so that he would win.
So that guaranteed riding is now leaning blue, everybody.
Like I said, no guaranteed ridings in this country anymore.
So it's a fascinating vice grip that the Liberals are in. And they're running out of options, running out of room, and running out of time.